This is Ryan Cook from Moody Theological Seminary, and in this video we want to talk about interpreting poetry in the Old Testament. Now this is a really important skill for us to get down because about a third of the Old Testament, kind of depending on how you count it, about a third of it is comprised of poetry. So knowing some tools of how Hebrew poetry communicates, some tips to be able to read it well is really critical for us to be able to understand the Old Testament in general. Now, in order to get at this, I'm going to start small with the individual line. Now, if I asked you, what makes a poem, like how do you know speech is poetry? You may have a number of different answers to that. You might talk about how it uses imagery or how it uses, plays with words and that type of thing. And those are certainly true. Some of you might think with English poetry that, boy, a lot of poems rhyme or have some sort of syllabic count that's consistent to structure the poem. When you look at Hebrew poetry, the engine that drives Hebrew poetry, the main thing that makes Hebrew poetry, is the use of parallelism. What do I mean by parallelism? I mean that the author will say something and then restate it in the next line. And it creates this sort of rhythm of balance where you have one line, then a parallel line, or sometimes you get what's called a tricolon or three lines. In very rare cases, you might get four lines that are all go together, but typically it's just these two lines that together form one particular thought. And to illustrate this, I've used Psalm 6 verses 1 and 2. And for verse 1, I put line A, line B. Those together are the two parallel lines that form the main thought. And then verse 2, line A, line B. Again, the two verses, or the two lines there go together to make the main thought of that verse. And let's take a close look at how these two lines relate. Really, the main question that I want to ask here is, how does line A in any of these poems relate to line B? And then we kind of start over in verse 2. How does line A relate to line B? Now, when we talk about parallelism, parallelism functions at many different levels. Not only does it function at the level of meaning, which is what we're going to talk about now, but also at the level of, syntax, grammar, verb conjugations, and all those sorts of things as well. Now here, I put in blue the individual components of each line or the words in each line and show how they parallel each other. So for example, in line A of verse 1, we have, "O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath." That's line 2. And we might wonder, how does line 2 relate to line 1 or line B relate to line A? Well, one way you can see is it restates line A. There's a number of things that are very much the same. Rebuke is paralleled by discipline, or anger is paralleled by wrath. And so you might say, well, it's just being repetitious. It's just saying the same thing again. But that's not really true either. If you look at line B, it doesn't say rebuke. It doesn't exactly repeat what's in line A, but it says it nuances what's in line A. So if you look at the verb discipline, that's a much more specific verb than rebuke. So don't rebuke me in your anger. Even more, God, don't discipline me. Discipline is a rebuke, maybe with an eye to correction or something along those lines. Similarly, if you look at the phrase that ends the first line, it says in your anger, and that's paralleled with in your wrath. Now, anger and wrath are much more similar concepts. But wrath, even in English, we can see wrath is a more vivid word. It's a more rare word for anger, maybe a little bit more weighty. And that's true in the Hebrew as well. The English translation here is trying to pick up on that. And so actually, the best way to probably understand this is to say line A provides the general topic under discussion that the poet's going to describe. Then line B sharpens or clarifies line A or carries it forward. And that carrying forward could happen in a number of different ways. Let's look at verse 2. Verse 2 says, "Be merciful to me, Lord, for I am faint. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are in agony." The first verb here is an imperative. Be merciful to me, Lord. Look at how that idea gets sharpened or clarified in the parallel line. How specifically does the psalmist want God to be merciful to him? Well, through healing him, right? Be merciful to me. Specifically, heal me. And then he says, "Be merciful to me, O Yahweh, O Lord, for I am faint. That's a pretty much a general description of physical, weariness. That gets a much more vivid picture in line B, where it says, "O Lord, heal me, for my bones are in agony." Again, you can see the vividness of that particular image. So in general, when approaching parallel lines, the best way to do it is to say, line A, what's more? Line B, line A, again, providing the general topic, the general area under discussion, and then that is going to get clarified, carried forward, sharpened, nuanced in line B. And line B will always have a seconding, more emphatic quality to it. And so that is going to help you read the intention of the poet, or where the poet wants to go with their particular statement that they're making. So that's just a really helpful tip as you read through Hebrew poetry. Think line A, what's more? Line B, how does the second line nuance or carry forward the idea of the previous line? Okay, having said that in general, here are, let's take a look at another verse and think about how this idea works. So line A, what's more? Line B. So here we have Psalm 2:4, which says, "The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord, or Yahweh, scoffs at them." This is pretty straightforward, right? The one enthroned in heaven is a pretty general reference to God. It's a kind of roundabout way of talking about God. That gets much more specific in the second line, where it's using the divine name, Yahweh, specifically. And then scoffing is a particular type of laughing, right? It's laughing with derision in it. So you can see how that idea works here. It's line A, and then that idea gets sharpened or carried forward in line B. Sometimes that sharpening can be by stating the opposite or something along those lines. So there are hundreds of different ways in which line B can relate to line A, but it's generally a seconding, sharpening, nuancing quality that we want to think about. Okay, having said that, there are 9 other characteristics I want to talk about with Hebrew poetry, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. It's like a best hits list of what makes Hebrew poetry. So the first is the 2 lines that I just talked about, they're balanced. So when you add line A with line B, on average in Hebrew, they're only 6 words in length. So these lines are short and they're balanced. They're either going to be like 4 words to 3 words, or 3 words to 3 words, or sometimes 3 words to 2 words, but they're going to be fairly balanced between the two. And these lines are going to complement each other through a close correspondence with some respect to the sound, phonological quality, the syntax, grammar, propositional relations, or just the meaning in general. They're going to be parallel at a number of different levels. Hebrew poems are terse. They use only the words necessary to communicate what they want to say, which means that often words are gapped, or there's ellipsis. Something will be stated in maybe line A and just assumed in line B, but not restated. In many cases, what we call prose particles, like the definite article, the word the in English, the direct object marker, the relative pronoun, a number of things that we might expect to normally be there aren't there, and it gives the poet this very terse feel, and that's pretty normal for Hebrew poetry. So you kind of got to get used to that. Poetry, like all poetry universally, Hebrew poetry uses a lot of figurative or symbolic language. Figures of speech abound in Hebrew poetry. Bert Janowski came up with this chart. It's really a pretty simple chart, but I found it to be kind of helpful, where he categorized, he's looking specifically at the Psalms, but it really works for any example of Hebrew poetry. Metaphors that the psalmists use, or symbols that the psalmists use, to describe either God's closeness or his blessing on his people or on the speaker, and then other images that are used for God's distance or his judgment. And then he subdivides each of those overall big categories into areas related to the world in general, like cosmology, human relationships, like sociology, or the person in general, anthropology. And you can see here, if the poet talks about things like light, day, the temple, protection, family, celebration, laughter, these are all images that celebrate God's presence, God's closeness in the experience of the speaker. On the other hand, darkness, silence, loneliness, disintegration, mourning, lament. These are things that reference God's distance or judgment. So little things like that can be helpful in thinking about how the Psalms communicate. The fourth characteristic of Hebrew poetry here is intensity. Poetic language is frequently heightened emotively by means of, exclamations, a lot of imperatives, cohortatives, jussives. This is speech at a pretty high register, an elevated register emotionally. So here's a quick example in Psalm 106 verses 1 to 6. In these 6 short verses, there are 10 imperatives where the psalmist is encouraging the congregation to respond. So you can see, give thanks, call, make known, sing, tell, glory, seek, remember. The psalmist wants to evoke a response in the audience and is very excited to get the audience on board with it in this particular psalm. And this is true just in general in Hebrew poetry. It's very heightened emotively. The fifth characteristic is transposition or unusual word order. A lot of times the poets craft with their words, not only in what they sound like, but not only in what words are used, but also in the order of the words. And they often don't follow what we might consider normal rules of word order. And this is true for English poets as well. The Hebrew poets definitely did this. So if we look at Psalm 6:3, we just looked at Psalm 6 verses 1 and 2. This is verse 3. I put in different colors, the individual Hebrew words. And so the first unit here is be gracious to me. That's one word in Hebrew. Yahweh, for frail am I. So if you think of each word as an A, B, C, or D, and then look at the second line here. Heal me, Yahweh, for in agony are my bones. If you just look at the parallelism, it matches perfectly. A, B, C, D to A, B, C, D. That's pretty straightforward. Other times, a poem is going to be the opposite. Like Psalm 7 verse 16 says, return his iniquity on his head, on his skull his violence comes down. This is again very literally following the word order in Hebrew. You have returns, the first word actually paralleled with the last word of the line, comes down. The 2 middle units are the same, iniquity paralleled with violence, and then the 2 inside units, on his head paralleled with on his skull. What you have here is an inverted parallelism, A, B, C, C, B, A units. And that's very common in Hebrew poetry. And often, line to line, the poet will mix it around to create devices like this. Or sometimes a poet will stick with one. Maybe it's A, B, C, C, B, A all the way through a poem. So it depends on the poetry. But this is one of the parts of the artistry of Hebrew poetry. Okay, the sixth quality. The sixth characteristic of Hebrew poetry is they sound good. They have a part of the way the poets communicate is not just through the semantics, the meaning of the words, but through their sound. It's a whole experience that they want the audience to have. And they'll often play around with rhythm, rhyme, consonants, assonance, and that sort of thing. This is one of the things that's very hard to capture in translation. Let me just give you a quick example of it. This is Psalm 23 verses 2 and 3. And I'll just read the Hebrew, and you can hear particularly the middle 3 lines, how that similar ending. So it starts with Adonai roi lo echsar, binot deshe yarbetzeni, al me menuchot yahanaleni, nafshi yeshovev yancheni, b'magle tzedek, lema'an shmo. Those middle 3 lines end with yarbetzeni, yanachaleni, yancheni. And it's hard to see that in English, but that kind of thing happens all the time in Hebrew poetry and is part of how the poets are communicating. Hebrew poetry, the seventh characteristic is it is dramatic. It uses a lot of direct discourse. Sometimes the poet will turn and speak directly to the audience, expecting a response, or speak directly to God, asking for a response there. And so one way of reading Hebrew poetry sometimes is to look at who's speaking to who within the poem and for what purpose. Is the psalmist speaking to God? Is the audience in view? Does he turn at certain points and address the congregation? Sometimes they speak directly to their enemies. Think of the oracles against the nations and the prophets, where the prophets will address Babylon or Assyria or some other foreign nation. The eighth characteristic of Hebrew poetry is they use strange or formal words. The Hebrew poets dig deep into the Hebrew lexicon. And this is true with English poets as well. If you ever read someone like T.S. Eliot, you have to sometimes have a dictionary right at your elbow to be able to understand what he's saying. That's true with Hebrew poetry too. If you're a brand new Hebrew student, it's often very frustrating to read poetry because the poets like to use different parts of the vocabulary that aren't often used in, say, narrative or more prose speech. And then finally, Hebrew poems are structured in strophes. The strophe is usually like maybe a 3 to 6 verse unit that functions kind of like a paragraph in prose, where it's a unique thought and then it'll shift to the next stanza. Maybe you could think of it like a strophe is kind of like a stanza in a hymn or something like that is another way to think about it. Okay, so that's a little bit about the linguistics of how Hebrew poetry works. I want to shift to talk about another element related to Hebrew poetry. And to do that, I want to start with this poem by John Davis that was written in, I believe, 2006. And we're not going to read the whole poem, but let me just look at the first part of it. It says this: silence in this suburb of cars and dogs, of roar and rumble, sudden thump at the railroad crossing. But this morning, before 5 a.m., there's only the wash, the waterfall of cars on I-25, which sounds in my ear, almost like the sound of blood in my arteries, that inner traffic. Let me just stop there and say, imagine you were an ancient Israelite and you were transported to the future and someone gave you this poem. Or maybe let's reverse that. Let's say you're an ancient Israelite and someone from the future comes to the past and gives them this poem. What are going to be some barriers for their understanding it? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? I mean, a suburb, what's a suburb? You and I might know what a suburb is intuitively. We live in cities and suburbs are a part of our landscape. The sudden thump at a railroad crossing, I can hear that in my ear. I know exactly what that feels like. Of course, that didn't exist in ancient Israel. Telling time by saying 5 a.m., I know exactly when that is. Time wasn't communicated in that way in ancient Israel. The I-25, what is that? So what I'm saying is a lot of the images that this poem draws from are concrete images from the modern world that if you didn't live in this world, if you lived in the past, you would have a very hard time understanding it. Well, now imagine the reverse situation. The same thing is actually true for us. As we read poems that are coming from ancient Israel, they lived in a world very different than ours, and their images are drawn from their own concrete experience. Now, we have the advantage of knowing that that's history, and we can study history and look at some of those images. It would be, of course, impossible for them in the past to study the future, to do the images, but we can look at the past, and we need to sometimes get out of our own cultural context and try to enter into the world of the poet to understand the images that are being used there. Let me give a quick example of that. This is Psalm 18:10. It says, "He, the Lord, rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind." Now, there's a couple of images here. I'm going to just focus on the one cherub. What comes to mind when you think of a cherub? For some of you, you might think of this image on the left-hand side of the screen, the sort of Renaissance, chubby baby image of a cherub. That's not an image that existed in the ancient world. They would have understood something more like what's in the middle of the screen there, like a winged sphinx. It's a very fearsome image, divine angelic being. That's what it would have been more in the mind of an ancient Israelite. And so we need to adjust our understanding and try to get at, okay, how would the original ancient Israelite audience have understood that particular image? Or another example from Psalm 18. This says, you, David here speaking, you are the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Well, what does that phrase mean, the horn of my salvation? Maybe is this like maybe a shofar, like a trumpet, or a silver trumpet, or what is this? What's actually being referred to here is the horn of an altar. When David here says, you are the horn of my salvation, he's referring to a practice in the ancient world where altars and sanctuaries had horns on them. And if you wanted to flee for refuge, if someone was seeking your life, one of the things you could do is run into the sanctuary and grab onto the horns of the altar. And that was basically like saying you were coming under the protection of the God that was worshipped at that altar. We see this in the Old Testament. When Adonijah, you might remember, tried to become king when David was still alive, but in his deathbed, Adonijah tried to proclaim himself as king, and then that backfired. David, acted quickly and made Solomon the king, and now Adonijah was afraid for his life. And it says here in 1 Kings 1:50, when Adonijah feared Solomon, so he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Again, this is coming under the protection of Yahweh, and he's saying, don't kill me. I'm coming. These are the horns of my salvation. In other words, is what the psalmist was referring to back in Psalm 18. Or another example of this is in Amos 3 verse 14, where Yahweh says, on that day I punish Israel for his transgressions. I will punish the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be shut off and fall to the ground. And there the command is, God prophetically is pronouncing judgment on the false idols at Bethel and saying the horns of that altar are going to be cut off, which means they won't be any protection for the people who worship at that calf idol in Bethel there. So you might wonder, how do I find these images? Like, this is great. How can I get some help in understanding it? Well, first, a good quality study Bible is going to have some notes that describe some of these things. I would recommend the IVP Bible Background Commentary. There's an Old Testament and a New Testament version of this. This will dive into a lot of the imagery. Or if you're just interested in familiarizing yourself with art from the ancient world, many images are posted from like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the ISAC, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago, or the British Museum or the Louvre. And if you just search their websites and type ancient Near Eastern art, you'll come up with all kinds of different images that are often really helpful. Let me just give a quick example now of how these images, talk about where they came from and one example of how they help in interpreting Hebrew poetry. So the images that you'll find if you go to these different sources are things like amulets or seals. You can see in the bottom right corner, I realize it's a little bit cut off for you, but there's a seal that is an image on a rolled disc that if you roll it out into soft clay, you can see the full image. That's a very common artifact from the ancient world. Ivories that were carved, you can see that on the top of the screen here is a carved ivory. Coins, of course this is going to be later into the Persian period, you start getting coins with images on them. You have statues and figurines, and then monumental art that kings would make. So these are all the kinds of things that we look at. How do we know what images were in the minds of ancient writers? These are some of the things that we can look at to be able to discern that. And then we have to ask, what's the relationship between the image and the text? So let me give an example where this has been helpful. So here's a very literal translation of Psalm 76:6. It says this: the powerful of heart were plundered. They sank into deep sleep, and all the men of war could not find their hands. Well, that last line, could not find their hands, has caused problems for translators. What does that mean? They couldn't find their hands. If you look at some modern translations, the ESV has all the men of war were unable to use their hands. So maybe it's an idiom. They couldn't find their hands means they couldn't use their hands. Or the NET Bible has all their warriors were helpless, right? They can't find their hands, so they're helpless. Or the Lexham English Bible says all the men cannot use their hands, very similar. Or the NRSV has none of the troops were able to lift a hand. It's a little bit different take on it. What's really at work here? Well, if you look at Psalm 76, it's describing the defeat of Israel's enemies. And so this is a military defeat. And in the context of a military defeat, there's actually quite a bit of ancient Near Eastern art related to the hands of fallen enemies. Here's one example. This comes from a temple wall in Luxor in Egypt. And it's after a battle. And you can see on the bottom right, all of these hands that are piled up. One of the ways that ancient armies, victorious armies, used to count the number of dead enemies that they had killed is they would cut off the hands of their defeated enemies and pile them up. And you can see here someone counting the hands and then a scribe behind them taking notes, right? So they want to know how great was our victory? Let's count, all the hands. And that's really the idea behind this verse is they're saying the powerful of heart were plundered. They sank into deep sleep. These are the enemies of Israel. And all the men of war could not find their hands. Their hands were gone because they had been cut off and were now being counted. So it's just an example of how these images can maybe help us understand what the authors are communicating. So these are just a few tips in reading Hebrew poetry. Understand the parallelism, right? Line A, what's more? Line B, how does line B sharpen it? And then think about the images. How do those images communicate and how would they have been understood in the ancient world?